We spent the last two lessons listening to the sounds around us in nature and even seeing them in the spectrum, in the spectrogram. And now I want to zoom way in on the sound and talk today about how sound works. How does something like a hummingbird wing flapping near our ear actually produce sound? What is sound? How does our ear and brain respond to it? And how can we measure it? So grab your favorite unnamed, unflavored, sparkling beverage or flat beverage of your choice, and let's do this. So sound is a disturbance in a medium that is perceived. So the medium is often air. Right now we can think about if I snap my fingers, there is a sound source, which would be the snapping, the medium, which is the air, and a receiver, which is my ear. So I hear myself snapping, and that's because the sound source is created a disturbance in the medium that is pushing the airwaves at my ear in positive and negative pressure, and I perceive that as sound. We have talked a little bit about a waveform. A waveform is a very important way of visualizing and studying sound. It's the graph that has a line through the center that is zero. If you think about flatlining, a sound would just be completely silent if it's only on that center line. But the way sound works is to oscillate positive and negative back and forth. So if we think about visually like a polygraph test or even the pendulum of a clock, think about something that moves back and forth. In fact, we could draw our own waveform on a piece of paper if we were to move a pencil in one direction, like a pendulum. So let's say we're moving the pencil back and forth this way. If we drew a line down the center of the page and then we moved our pencil like this, we could pull the page along as we move, and we would be graphing sound like a waveform. So let's look now briefly at a waveform and remind ourselves of what that shows. You can see here the zero line and the line or the area for -1 and +1 up above. Notice that this wave moves from 0 up to about 1, back down to 0, down to -1, and back to 0. And in a moment we'll talk about that as a cycle. So just keep in mind that as sound moves toward and away from our ears, it's creating these differences of pressure, which are what equate volume. So this -1 and this +1 are the same volume to our ear. You can just think about it as a distance from 0. I like to think about the hummingbird and its wings. So the hummingbird gets its name for obvious reasons. It makes a humming sound when it comes nearby. That's because its wings are flapping so fast. They flap fast enough to be in our audio range as a pitch. Of course, larger birds will flap their wings, just not nearly as fast, so they wouldn't be heard as pitch, but more like a rhythm. The hummingbird can flap their wings from about 50 to 200 times per second. In our language, that converts to 50 to 200 hertz. So well playable by a guitar or a bass or a piano or sung. This example that we're going to listen to in a moment is a recording of a hummingbird coming up to a feeder, and we will hear how as it flaps its wings, we hear the cycles per second, we hear it as a pitch. And that pitch is around 100 hertz, which is like a G sharp, a few frets up on the guitar or in the mid-low range of the piano. Let's hear that. So first we're going to listen to this recording of a hummingbird. You will also hear some other bugs and nature sounds outdoors, but we're focused on the low pitch that is the flapping speed of the hummingbird's wings. So the hummingbird is flapping its wings at a very consistent rate of about 100 times per second. So in our language of frequency, that means 100 cycles per second, or 100 hertz. As we look at this sound and zoom in, we can see that it has a repeating shape that keeps coming back. And that repeating shape is called a period. It makes this a periodic sound and thus has a pitch. And each period is called a cycle. So if we trace one of these and look at our time up here, we can see how fast the frequency of these flaps are occurring. So if I zoom in to the point where up top here we see 2.08, 2.09, 2.10. I'll zoom in a little further. If you can't see these up here, again, that's 2.08, 2.09, and 2.10. So those are 100ths of a second. So if I look at the distance of 100th of a second here, let's see what happens. In this case, from 2.08 to 2.09, the sound starts above the zero line. So it starts up here with positive pressure. It comes down to the zero line. It crosses below down to negative pressure, back up to zero, and then back up to positive pressure to about the same place that we started over here. So that's a full cycle. Usually cycles are measured starting here on the zero line, which is also 1/10 of a second, but I wanted to show the span of about 100th of a second, not 1/10 of a second. So this is about 100th of a second, meaning that this happens 100 times per second. So that's another way of saying 100 hertz. So the natural flapping of these wings creates a periodic repeating cycle of sound that happens 100 times per second and creates our perception of its pitch. So when we tell a speaker to play back this recording, we're telling it to move out away from your ear, come back and move toward your ear, and come back and try to recreate exactly what we heard from the hummingbird. So frequency is a measure of cycles per second. The more cycles we have per second, the higher the frequency, the faster the frequency. So we use these words high and low to describe frequency, but nothing is actually high or low about them. There are faster and slower frequencies. So a slower frequency like 20 hertz gives us a perception of a low pitch, and a fast frequency like 10,000 hertz gives us the impression of a high pitch. The reason that we call them high and low is because in musical notation, we notate a very low note at the bottom of the staff, and that is akin to a slow frequency. When we notate a high pitch way above the staff, that equates a fast frequency. Also, in the spectrogram, when we look at the graph of time and frequency, if we see something way at the top, we say that that is a high frequency. Really what it is a fast frequency. But it's totally fine to use these terms high and low. I just wanted to speak to that for a moment. All right, I'd like to thank the hummingbird and all things that make sound. Now we've got a little bit of a handle on waveforms, frequency, and our perception of pitch. Next time we're moving on to the limits of human hearing and what is beyond our hearing in both directions, the very, very high and the very, very low. I'll see you next time.